The cold rain pounded against the windshield as Sarah gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white with tension. She glanced nervously at the rearview mirror, her eyes darting around the deserted suburban street. Something wasn't right. The usually bustling cul-de-sac was eerily silent, save for the patter of the downpour. She had to get home. Now. Pressing her foot down on the accelerator, Sarah's car lurched forward, its tires splashing through the puddles. As she rounded the corner, a wave of panic hit her. The house was dark, every window shrouded in darkness. Where were the twinkling holiday lights that had been strung up just days ago? Pulling into the driveway, Sarah frantically fumbled for her keys, her hands trembling. The front door was unlocked, and she burst into the foyer, her heart pounding. "Hello, honey, are you there?" she called out, her voice echoing in the eerie silence. No response. Sarah's gaze swept the room, taking in the overturned furniture and shattered glass. A sense of dread washed over her. What had happened here? Steeling her nerves, she cautiously made her way upstairs, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. The bedroom door stood ajar, and she peered inside, her breath catching in her throat. Her husband, John, lay unconscious on the bed, his face bruised and bloodied. Rushing to his side, she gently shook his shoulder, panic rising in her chest. "John? John, wake up. What happened?" A sudden noise from the closet made her freeze, her heart pounding in her ears. Slowly, she approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the knob. The door flew open, and a figure lunged at her, a glint of metal in their hand. Sarah screamed, her arms raised in a desperate attempt to defend herself. "Stay back," a gruff voice growled, the knife blade mere inches from her face. Sarah's eyes widened in recognition. "Mr. Daniels? What is the meaning of this?" The elderly man, a prominent member of the Homeowners Association, glared at her, his weathered face contorted with rage. "You think you can defy the HOA and get away with it?" He spat, his grip on the knife tightening. Sarah's mind raced, piecing together the scattered clues. The missing lights, the vandalized home, and now this confrontation with the HOA president. It all made sense. "The holiday lights," she whispered, her gaze darting to the unconscious form of her husband. "You had them removed, didn't you?" Mr. Daniels' lips curled into a sinister smile. "And so much more. You see, Sarah, the HOA doesn't take kindly to those who defy our rules. We have a strict code of conduct, and you flagrantly violated it." Sarah's heart sank as the realization dawned on her. The HOA, a powerful and unforgiving entity, had orchestrated this entire ordeal, all to maintain their iron grip on the community. But the lights were sponsored by the city, she protested, her voice trembling. I didn't do anything wrong." Mr. Daniels let out a cold, mirthless laugh. "The city? Bah, they're nothing compared to the might of the HOA. We run this neighborhood, Sarah, and we don't take kindly to those who challenge our authority." He took a step forward, the knife gleaming in the dim light. "Now, it's time to teach you a lesson." Sarah's mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. As Mr. Daniels closed in, she knew she had to act fast. Her life, and her husband's, depended on it. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stared down the barrel of Mr. Daniels' knife. The elderly HOA president advanced menacingly, his eyes narrowed with malice. "Please, Mr. Daniels, this is all a misunderstanding," Sarah pleaded, her voice shaking. "The lights were approved by the city." "Silence." He barked, his grip on the knife tightening. "The HOA is the supreme authority here, and we will not tolerate any defiance of our rules." Casting a quick glance at the unconscious form of her husband, Sarah knew she had to act quickly. Thinking fast, she raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. Okay, I understand," she said, her tone conciliatory. "I'll remove the lights, I promise. Just, please, let me help John." Mr. Daniels' lips curled into a cruel smile. Oh, I have plans for your husband. But first, you need to learn your place. He lunged forward, the knife glinting in the dim light. Sarah barely had time to react before the blade sliced through the air, heading straight for her. In a desperate move, she grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and swung it with all her might, connecting with Mr. Daniels' hand. The knife clattered to the floor as the HOA president let out a howl of pain. Seizing the opportunity, Sarah dashed past him, her heart racing. She had to get help, call the police, anything to stop this madness. But as she reached the top of the stairs, a sudden movement in the shadows made her freeze. A figure emerged, blocking her path, and she gasped in horror. Mr. Wilkins, she breathed, recognizing the portly HOA vice president. Going somewhere, Sarah? He drawled, a sinister grin spreading across his face. Sarah's mind raced, desperate for a way out. Please, you have to understand. The lights were approved by the city. I didn't do anything wrong. Mr. Wilkins let out a derisive laugh. The city? Oh, my dear, you have no idea how little power they hold in this community. The HOA is the true authority here, and we don't take kindly to those who defy us. He took a step forward, his hand reaching into his coat pocket. Sarah's eyes widened as she caught a glimpse of a sleek, black device. What are you? Shh, Mr. Wilkins interrupted, his finger pressing against the button. This is just a little something to ensure your compliance. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness, save for the eerie glow of a small display on the device in Mr. Wilkins' hand. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine as she realized what it was, a remote control for the home's security system. You see, Sarah, Mr. Wilkins said, his voice dripping with menace, the HOA has eyes and ears everywhere. We know everything that goes on in this neighborhood, and we don't take kindly to those who try to defy us. Sarah's heart sank as she grasped the full extent of the HOA's power. They had control over the very infrastructure of the community, and they weren't afraid to use it to maintain their grip. Please, she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper, don't do this. I'll do whatever you want, just don't hurt my family. Mr. Wilkins' grin widened. That's more like it. Now let's discuss how you're going to make this right with the HOA. As Sarah stood there, trapped in the darkness, she knew she had to find a way to outsmart these ruthless HOA overlords. Her family's safety depended on it, and she was determined to do whatever it took to protect them. The stage was set for a high-stakes power struggle, with Sarah pitted against the formidable force of the HOA. The battle lines had been drawn, and the outcome would have far-reaching consequences for the entire community. Sarah's mind raced as she stood in the darkness, trapped between the two HOA officials. She knew she had to find a way to outmaneuver them, but with their control over the home's security system, the odds seemed stacked against her. Please, Mr. Wilkins, let's talk about this, she pleaded, her voice trembling. I'm sure we can come to some kind of agreement. The HOA vice president chuckled, his finger still poised over the remote control. Oh, Sarah, you really don't understand, do you? The HOA doesn't negotiate. We dictate the terms, and you will comply. Glancing back toward the bedroom, Sarah's heart sank as she thought of her unconscious husband. She had to find a way to get help, to stop this madness before it was too late. What do you want from me? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Simple, Mr. Wilkins replied, his tone uncompromising. You will remove those city-sponsored lights immediately, and you will issue a public apology to the HOA for your defiance. And of course, you will never, ever challenge the HOA's authority again. Sarah's mind raced, searching for a loophole, a way to turn the tables on these ruthless HOA officials. She couldn't give in to their demands, not when the safety of her family was at stake. And if I refuse? She asked, her voice laced with defiance. Mr. Wilkins' lips curled into a malicious smile. Then I'm afraid we'll have to take more drastic measures. He pressed a button on the remote, and Sarah felt a sudden jolt of electricity course through her body. She let out a scream as the pain seared through her nerves, dropping to her knees. "You see, the HOA has its ways of ensuring compliance," Mr. Wilkins said, his voice dripping with a twisted sense of satisfaction. As the pain subsided, Sarah glared up at the HOA official, her eyes narrowed with determination. "You won't get away with this," she spat. "Oh, but we already have," Mr. Wilkins replied, his tone laced with arrogance. "The HOA is the true power in this community, and we will do whatever it takes to maintain our control." Suddenly, a loud crash from the bedroom jolted them both. Sarah's heart raced as she realized that John must have regained consciousness and was fighting back. Mr. Wilkins' eyes widened, and he quickly pressed another button on the remote. "Tesk, Tesk, Sarah, you should have listened to us." The room was plunged into darkness once more, and Sarah could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. She braced herself, ready to face whatever the HOA had in store for her and her family. But just as the figure emerged from the shadows, a flicker of light caught her eye. A small, flickering glow emanated from the remote control in Mr. Wilkins' hand, and Sarah's mind raced with a desperate plan. Surging forward, she lunged at the HOA official, her hand reaching for the device. Mr. Wilkins let out a startled cry, but Sarah's fingers closed around the remote, yanking it from his grasp. In the darkness, she felt her way toward the nearest window, her heart pounding. With a deep breath, she hurled the remote through the glass, shattering it. The room was suddenly flooded with light, and Sarah blinked, her eyes adjusting to the sudden brightness. Mr. Wilkins stood frozen, his face a mask of horror. "No," he screamed, his hands grasping at the shattered window. Sarah didn't hesitate. Seizing the opportunity, she raced to the bedroom, where she found John struggling to his feet, his face bruised and bloodied. "John, we have to get out of here now," she cried, pulling him toward the door. As they made their way down the stairs and out of the house, Sarah could hear the distant sound of sirens. The HOA's control had been disrupted, at least for now, and she knew they had to move quickly to escape the wrath of these powerful and ruthless officials. The battle had only just begun, but Sarah was determined to fight for her family's safety, no matter the cost. Sarah and John raced down the rain-soaked streets, their hearts pounding with adrenaline. Behind them, the distant wail of sirens cut through the night, a grim reminder of the peril they had just escaped. "We have to get out of here, John," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "The HOA, there—" I know," her husband interrupted, his face etched with a mixture of fear and determination. "We need to find somewhere safe, someplace they can't reach us." As they turned the corner, Sarah's gaze landed on a dimly lit cafe, its windows the only source of light in the otherwise deserted neighborhood. Grabbing John's hand, she steered him toward the entrance, praying it would offer them a temporary refuge. The bell above the door chimed as they burst inside, drawing the attention of the lone barista behind the counter. Her eyes widened as she took in their disheveled appearance. "Are you two all right?" she asked, concern lacing her voice. Sarah hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. We need a place to hide. Can you help us?" The barista's brow furrowed, but she quickly nodded. "Of course, come with me." Ushering them through a door behind the counter, she led them into a small, cozy apartment. "You can stay here for now. It's not much, but it should be safe." Sarah let out a shaky breath, sinking into a worn armchair. "Thank you. We didn't know where else to go." John paced the room, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "The HOA, they're after us. We have to find a way to stop them before they—" His voice trailed off, and Sarah reached out to squeeze his hand, offering a reassuring squeeze. "We'll figure this out, John. We have to." The barista cleared her throat, drawing their attention. "I couldn't help but overhear. The HOA. What's going on?" Sarah nodded, her gaze downcast. They've taken over our neighborhood, controlling everything. And now, they're after us for defying their rules. The barista's eyes widened, and she let out a low whistle. That's insane. I've heard rumors about the HOA, but I never imagined they'd stoop to something like this. John stepped forward, his voice urgent. Do you know anyone who can help us? Someone who can stand up to the HOA and their corruption. The barista pursed her lips, her brow furrowed in thought. Well, there's one person who might be able to help, but it's a long shot. Please, we'll take any help we can get, Sarah pleaded. All right, well, there's a local lawyer, Samantha Nguyen. She's been trying to take down the HOA for years, but they've always managed to outmaneuver her. The barista paused, her expression grim. But if anyone can help you, it's her. John and Sarah exchanged a hopeful glance. Where can we find her? John asked, his voice filled with determination. The barista scribbled an address on a napkin and handed it to him. Be careful, you two. The HOA doesn't take kindly to those who challenge their authority. As they stepped back out into the rain, Sarah and John knew they were embarking on a perilous journey. The HOA was a formidable adversary with far-reaching power and influence. But with their family's safety at stake, they were willing to take the risk. With the napkin clutched tightly in his hand, John led the way, his steps filled with a renewed sense of purpose. They were about to face off against the most powerful force in their community, and the outcome would determine the fate of their entire neighborhood. The rain pounded against the windshield as Sarah and John sped through the deserted streets, their destination looming in the distance. The address the barista had provided led them to a modest office building, its neon sign casting an eerie glow in the night. This is the place, John said, his voice low and tense. Sarah reached over and gave his hand a gentle squeeze. Are you ready for this? He nodded, his jaw set with determination. We don't have a choice. The HOA won't stop until they've crushed us. We have to take a stand for our family's sake. With a deep breath, they stepped out of the car and hurried toward the entrance, the rain soaking their clothes. The lobby was dimly lit, and an air of unease hung in the air, as if the very walls were laced with the weight of countless battles against the HOA. They approached the receptionist's desk, where a young woman sat typing furiously on her computer. Excuse me, John said, his voice barely above a whisper. We're here to see Samantha Nguyen. Is she available? The receptionist looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. Do you have an appointment? Sarah and John exchanged a nervous glance. No, but it's an emergency, Sarah replied, her voice tinged with desperation. The receptionist's expression softened slightly, and she nodded. Wait here. I'll see if she can see you. Moments later, a tall, slender woman with striking features emerged from a nearby office, her dark eyes sweeping over them with a keen gaze. I'm Samantha Nguyen. What can I do for you? Sarah and John quickly explained their plight, their words tumbling out in a rush of fear and urgency. Samantha listened intently, her brow furrowing with each new revelation. The HOA is behind this, she asked, her voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and anger. John nodded, his hands clenched into fists. They're trying to intimidate us, to force us into submission. But we won't back down. Not this time. Samantha's lips curved into a grim smile. Well, you've certainly come to the right place. The HOA and I have a long history, and I've been waiting for an opportunity like this. She motioned for them to follow her into her office, closing the door behind them. All right, let's see what we can do to take these HOA bullies down. For the next hour, Samantha pored over documents, made phone calls, and scribbled furiously on a legal pad, her mind racing with strategies and tactics. Sarah and John watched, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. The good news is that the HOA's actions are clearly illegal, Samantha finally announced, her eyes gleaming with a determined fire. They've overstepped their bounds, and we can use that against them. John let out a sigh of relief, while Sarah felt a surge of cautious optimism. So what's the plan? Samantha leaned back in her chair, a crafty smile on her lips. First, we need to gather as much evidence as possible. Anything that can prove the HOA's corruption and abuse of power. Then, we'll take them to court, and we'll make sure the whole world knows what they've been up to. Sarah's eyes widened. The whole world? But won't that just make them come after us even harder? Samantha nodded, her expression grave. It's a risk, but it's the only way to truly take them down. The HOA thrives on secrecy and intimidation. We need to strip them of that power, to expose them for the corrupt entity they are. John reached out and squeezed Sarah's hand, his gaze filled with a fierce determination. We're in. Whatever it takes, we'll do it. Samantha stood up, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. Then let's get to work. The fight against the HOA is just beginning, and we're going to win. As they stepped out into the rain-soaked streets, Sarah and John knew they were embarking on a perilous journey. The HOA was a formidable foe, but with Samantha and Gwion on their side, they finally had a glimmer of hope. The battle lines had been drawn, and the fate of their entire community hung in the balance. The rain had given way to a thick, oppressive fog that blanketed the streets as Sarah and John made their way back to the car, their minds racing with the weight of Samantha and Gwion's plan. Do you really think we can take down the HOA? Sarah asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. John squeezed her hand reassuringly. We have to try, Sarah. For our family, for our neighbors. We can't let the HOA continue to terrorize our community. As they slid into the car, a sense of foreboding settled over them. The once vibrant neighborhood had been reduced to a somber, shadowy landscape, the twinkling holiday lights that had once adorned the homes now conspicuously absent. I just can't believe the HOA would go to such lengths to maintain their control, Sarah murmured, her gaze fixed on the empty streets. John's knuckles tightened around the steering wheel. They're ruthless, Sarah. We've seen that firsthand. But with Samantha on our side, we might just have a chance. Navigating the winding, fog-shrouded roads, they reached their driveway, their home a stark contrast to the surrounding darkness. The once festive exterior now stood bare, the holiday decorations they had so proudly displayed now a distant memory. As they stepped out of the car, the eerie silence of the neighborhood sent a chill down their spines. Pausing at the front door, Sarah couldn't help but glance nervously over her shoulder, her senses heightened for any sign of movement. Do you think they're still watching us? She whispered, her voice barely audible. John shook his head, his expression grim. I wouldn't put it past them. The HOA has eyes and ears everywhere, remember. With a deep breath, they stepped inside, the familiar surroundings offering a fleeting sense of comfort. But as they surveyed the damage from the earlier confrontation, the reality of their situation weighed heavily upon them. Where do we even start? Sarah asked, her gaze sweeping across the overturned furniture and shattered glass. John reached out and pulled her into a tight embrace. We start by getting our home back in order. And then, we do whatever it takes to bring down the HOA, once and for all. As they set to work, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway sent a jolt of panic through them. Exchanging a fearful glance, they'd braced themselves for another encounter with the HOA's henchmen. But to their surprise, it was not Mr. Daniels or Mr. Wilkins who emerged from the vehicle, but rather a familiar face from the neighborhood, their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Patel. Sarah, John, she exclaimed, her eyes wide with concern. I saw the police earlier, and I've been so worried. What's going on? Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Oh, Mrs. Patel, it's been a nightmare. The HOA, there. Before she could finish, the sound of a car door slamming interrupted them. Whirling around, they were greeted by the sight of Mr. Daniels and Mr. Wilkins, their faces contorted with rage. You! Mr. Daniels spat, his finger pointing accusingly at Sarah and John. I should have known you'd come crawling back here. John stepped forward, his voice steady and resolute. We're not going anywhere, Mr. Daniels. The HOA's reign of terror ends here. Mrs. Patel's eyes widened, and she quickly moved to stand beside them, her expression filled with a newfound determination. If you think we're going to let you continue to terrorize our community, you're sadly mistaken. The two HOA officials exchanged a glance, their lips curling into malicious grins. Oh, but you see, Mrs. Patel, we're just getting started. As the tension in the air thickened, Sarah and John knew that the true battle had only just begun. With their neighbors' unexpected support, they felt a glimmer of hope, but the looming threat of the HOA's ruthless tactics still hung over them like a dark cloud. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine the fate of their entire community, and they were determined to emerge victorious, no matter the cost. The standoff in the driveway was tense, the air thick with an unspoken threat. Sarah and John stood shoulder to shoulder with their neighbor, Mrs. Patel, facing off against the two menacing figures of Mr. Daniels and Mr. Wilkins, the HOA officials who had terrorized their community. So, you've decided to band together, have you? Mr. Daniels sneered, his beady eyes narrowing with contempt. How quaint. Mrs. Patel stepped forward, her chin held high. We won't let you bully us anymore, Mr. Daniels. The days of the HOA's unchecked power are over. John felt a surge of pride at his neighbor's defiant stance, and he knew that they had to seize this moment to turn the tables on the HOA. That's right, he chimed in, his voice firm and unwavering. We have evidence of your corruption, your underhanded tactics, and we're taking it all to the authorities. Mr. Wilkins let out a derisive laugh. Evidence? You really think that will stop us? The HOA has eyes and ears everywhere, and we'll make sure your little evidence vanishes before it ever sees the light of day. Sarah's heart raced as she listened to the HOA officials' casual dismissal of their efforts. But then, an idea began to take shape in her mind. A risky gambit, but one that just might give them the edge they needed. Oh, I don't think you understand, she said, her voice dripping with feigned confidence. We've already made sure that the evidence is out there, where everyone can see it. Mr. Daniels and Mr. Wilkins exchanged a startled glance, and Sarah knew she had their attention. What are you talking about? Mr. Daniels demanded, his brow furrowed with suspicion. We've gone to the media, the city council, even the state attorney general. Sarah continued, her eyes narrowing. The whole world is going to know about the HOA's corruption, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The two HOA officials went deathly silent, their expressions shifting from arrogance to a mixture of shock and rage. You're bluffing, Mr. Wilkins spat, his hands clenching into fists. Sarah shook her head, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. Try me. The moment you try to silence us, the story goes live. And trust me, the fallout will be spectacular. For a long moment, the tension in the air was palpable, as the two sides stared each other down. Then, Mr. Daniels and Mr. Wilkins exchanged a terse nod, their faces etched with a grudging acceptance. Very well, Mr. Daniels said, his voice laced with barely contained fury. Consider this a temporary truce, but mark my words, you haven't seen the last of the HOA. With that, the two officials turned and retreated to their car, their tires screeching as they sped away, leaving Sarah, John, and Mrs. Patel in the driveway, stunned by their sudden capitulation. Did that just work? Mrs. Patel asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Sarah let out a shaky laugh, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. I can't believe it, but I think it did, at least for now. John pulled her into a tight embrace, his relief palpable. You were brilliant, Sarah. I don't know how you did it, but you just might have saved us. As the three of them stood there, the fog slowly lifting to reveal the first glimmers of dawn, Sarah felt a sense of cautious optimism. They had bought themselves some time, but she knew the battle was far from over. The HOA was a formidable adversary, and they wouldn't give up without a fight. But with their newfound resolve and the support of their neighbors, Sarah and John were determined to take them down, once and for all. The stage was set for a final showdown, and the fate of their community hung in the balance. The sun had barely begun to rise, casting a warm glow over the once darkened neighborhood, when Sarah, John, and Mrs. Patel heard the distant wail of sirens approaching. Their hearts raced with a mixture of hope and trepidation, knowing that the true battle with the HOA was far from over. "Do you think the police are coming for us?" Mrs. Patel asked, her voice trembling. John shook his head, his brow furrowed in concentration. "No, I don't think so." Samantha must have followed through with her plan. As the sirens grew louder, a parade of police cars and news vans rounded the corner, converging on their street. Sarah felt a surge of relief, realizing that their gambit had paid off. "They're here," she breathed, her eyes shining with a newfound determination. Moments later, a contingent of officers spilled out of the vehicles, quickly establishing a perimeter around the HOA officials' homes. Meanwhile, a swarm of reporters rushed toward the scene, their cameras and microphones at the ready. Mr. Daniels and Mr. Wilkins emerged from their homes, their faces etched with a mix of shock and fury. They tried to push past the officers, demanding to know what was happening, but the police held firm, informing them of their rights and the charges they faced. Sarah, John, and Mrs. Patel watched in awe as the spectacle unfolded before them, the weight of their ordeal finally lifting from their shoulders. "It's really happening," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the commotion. Samantha Nguyen, the fiercely determined lawyer they had turned to for help, strode toward them, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. "I told you we'd bring them down," she said, a wry smile playing on her lips. John reached out and shook her hand, his grip firm and grateful. "I don't know how you did it, but we can't thank you enough." Samantha's expression sobered, and she glanced over at the scene unfolding around them. "It wasn't easy, but the evidence you provided, combined with my team's investigation, was enough to bring the HOA's corrupt practices to light." "And the media?" Sarah asked, her gaze sweeping over the throng of reporters. "They're here to cover the story," Samantha replied, her voice filled with a sense of satisfaction. "Once the charges against the HOA officials are made public, the whole world will know the truth about their abuse of power." Mrs. Patel stepped forward, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Samantha. Not just for us, but for the entire community. We've lived under the HOA's shadow for far too long." Samantha nodded, her expression softening. "It's not over yet, but this is a significant victory. The HOA's grip on this neighborhood is finally starting to slip." As the police continued to escort the HOA officials into custody, the crowd of onlookers grew, with more and more neighbors emerging from their homes to witness the spectacle. Sarah felt a surge of pride, knowing that they had stood up to the powerful HOA and emerged victorious, at least for now. But as the initial euphoria began to subside, a realization dawned on her. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Samantha's expression grew serious. "The HOA won't give up without a fight. They'll do everything in their power to regain control, and we'll have to be vigilant to ensure they don't succeed." Sarah and John exchanged a worried glance, but Samantha placed a reassuring hand on their shoulders. "But you're not alone in this," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "The community is behind you, and together, we'll make sure the HOA never terrorizes this neighborhood again." As the sun continued to rise, illuminating the once darkened streets, Sarah felt a renewed sense of hope. The battle may have been won, but the war against the HOA was far from over. But with their newfound allies and a determination to reclaim their community, she knew they were more than ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The story of their triumph over the HOA's corruption had only just begun.